The iron bell of the auction house clanged through the humid air of Natchez, Mississippi, on that scorching afternoon in July 1851. The sound cut through the marketplace chatter like a blade, drawing every eye toward the wooden platform where human lives would be bartered and sold like livestock. Among the crowd of planters, merchants, and speculators stood a man who seemed out of place in that gathering of eager buyers. His name was Thomas Whitmore, and unlike the others who studied the auction block with calculating eyes, measuring profit against investment, he stood rigid with barely concealed disgust at the spectacle before him. Thomas was 32 years old, tall and lean, with prematurely graying hair at his temples that made him look older than his years. He wore a simple black suit, well made but unadorned, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who had spent time outdoors despite his obvious education and means. He owned a modest plantation called Riverside, about 15 miles north of Natchez, a property he had inherited from his father just 2 years prior. The inheritance had been both blessing and curse, for it came with land, a house, and the moral weight of 70 enslaved souls whose lives were now bound to his decisions. Thomas had spent those 2 years in a state of internal torment. He had been educated in the North, at a Quaker school in Pennsylvania where his mother's family had connections. There, he had been exposed to abolitionist ideas, had read Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe, had sat in meetings where people spoke of slavery as the great sin of the nation. But theory was one thing, and reality another. When his father died and left him a working plantation in the heart of Mississippi cotton country, Thomas found himself trapped between his conscience and his circumstances. He could not simply free 70 people into a world that would arrest them as runaways or force them back into slavery. The laws were designed to make liberation nearly impossible, to trap both enslaved and enslaver in a system that benefited only those who embraced its cruelty without question. Before we continue with this shocking story about the gorilla, don't forget to comment which city you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Let's strengthen our community together. Thank you, and now back to the story. Thomas had tried to run Riverside differently. He had abolished physical punishment, paid small wages that enslaved workers could save, allowed families to stay together, and provided better food and housing than neighboring plantations. But he knew these gestures were inadequate, mere drops of mercy in an ocean of injustice. He remained a slave owner, and no amount of kind treatment could erase that fundamental wrong. The contradiction ate at him daily, stealing his sleep and his peace. He had come to the auction today not by choice, but by necessity, twisted by circumstance. His overseer, a man named Daniels, who Thomas had inherited along with the property and never fully trusted, had informed him that 3 young women were being sold from a neighboring estate that had gone bankrupt. Daniels had heard through the network of gossip that connected all the plantations that a particularly vicious buyer, a man named Cyrus Blackwood, intended to purchase these women for purposes that had nothing to do with fieldwork or domestic service. Blackwood ran what was politely called a fancy trade, acquiring young enslaved women of light complexion or particular beauty and selling them to wealthy men in New Orleans and Mobile as concubines and objects of exploitation. His business was technically legal, but morally repugnant, even to many who otherwise supported slavery. Daniels, despite his rough exterior, had daughters of his own and had been disturbed enough by the rumors to bring them to Thomas's attention. He had said simply that if Thomas wanted to prevent 3 lives from being destroyed in that particular fashion, he had better be at the auction with money in hand. Thomas had spent the previous night pacing his study, wrestling with the dilemma. Buying people to save them from worse buyers was still buying people. It made him complicit in the system he despised, but allowing them to be sold to Blackwood without attempting intervention was a different kind of moral failure. Finally, as dawn broke over the Mississippi River, he had made his decision. He would buy them if necessary, and then he would find a way to ultimately free them, even if it took years to navigate the legal obstacles. Now he stood in the pressing crowd as the auctioneer, a red-faced man named Simmons, began his work. The morning had already seen the sale of 24 men for field work. A group of children sold away from their parents despite their screams, and several domestic workers purchased by various town families. Each transaction drove a spike deeper into Thomas's conscience, but he forced himself to remain, to wait for the moment that had brought him here. Finally, Simmons called out in his booming voice that carried across the square. Next, we have 3 prime young females, lately from the Ashford estate. All 3 are sisters, healthy, strong, and he paused for emphasis that drew knowing looks from some in the crowd, certified untouched. Suitable for housework or for gentlemen with more particular interests. His wink was grotesque, and Thomas felt his stomach turn. 3 young women were led onto the platform. They were chained at the wrists, wearing simple cotton shifts that did little to protect their dignity. The eldest appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark skin and a face that fought to maintain composure even as terror showed in her eyes. The middle sister was perhaps 20, lighter-skinned, trembling visibly but holding her head up through sheer force of will. The youngest could not have been more than 18, and tears streamed silently down her face as she clutched a small cloth bundle that contained what Thomas assumed were her only possessions in the world. Simmons began his sales pitch, describing their qualities like he was selling horses, noting their ages: Clara aged 23, Hannah aged 21, and Ruth aged 18. Their health, their skills in cooking and sewing, and repeatedly emphasizing their virtue, a word that in this context was stripped of all meaning and made into mere commodity. The bidding began immediately. A local planter offered $800 for the set. Another countered with $900. Then Thomas saw him, Cyrus Blackwood, a thin man with oiled hair and expensive clothes that could not hide the corruption underneath. He raised his hand casually and offered $1,200, a sum high enough to signal serious intent and warn off casual bidders. The crowd murmured. $1,200 was far above market value for 3 domestic workers, and everyone understood what it meant. Blackwood was willing to pay premium prices because he knew he could sell these women for far more in New Orleans's hidden markets, where wealthy men paid staggering sums for enslaved women they could abuse without social consequences. The auctioneer smiled, clearly pleased with the high bid, going once at $1,200 for all 3. Thomas felt his moment slipping away. His heart hammered in his chest. He had brought $1,500, nearly all his available cash, money that should have gone to purchasing supplies for the plantation. His hands were sweating and his mouth was dry, but he forced himself to move. $1,500, he called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Every head turned. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he searched for the source of this challenge. When he spotted Thomas, recognition flickered across his face, followed by something harder, anger at being opposed. The 2 men knew each other by reputation. Thomas was known as the eccentric planter who treated his slaves too softly, who had peculiar northern notions, who was quietly disapproved of by his neighbors, even as they did business with him. Blackwood was known for what he was, a predator who made his living off the destruction of vulnerable lives. Simmons looked between the 2 bidders, sensing drama that would make this sale memorable. $1,500 from Mr. Whitmore of Riverside. Do I hear 16? Blackwood's jaw tightened. He could go higher, certainly, but doing so would eat into his profit margin. More importantly, his pride was engaged now. Being outbid by someone like Thomas, someone who represented everything he and his peers found weak and contemptible, was galling. He raised his hand. $1,600. Thomas felt sweat running down his back, despite the shade of the courthouse overhang where he stood. He had reached his limit. He had no more cash available, not without selling property or taking loans that would put his plantation at risk. But as he looked at the three women on the platform, as he saw the oldest sister's eyes find his face with something that might have been desperate hope, he found himself speaking anyway. $1,700, and I will pay in gold coin within the hour. The crowd erupted in excited chatter. This was extraordinary, a bidding war between two men representing opposite poles of their society, and over three enslaved women who most present would have valued at half these prices. Blackwood's face had gone red. $1,700 was too much. He would lose money at that price after his costs and the bribes he paid to various officials who overlooked his business. But more than money, he was being humiliated in front of the entire town by a man most considered a fool. He opened his mouth to bid again, but one of his associates, a cold-eyed man who handled his accounts, put a restraining hand on his arm and shook his head slightly. The economics did not work at this price. Blackwood closed his mouth, but the look he shot Thomas promised that this would not be forgotten. Simmons, delighted with the unprecedented sum, brought down his gavel with a crack like a gunshot. Sold to Thomas Whitmore for $1,700. The three women are yours, sir. Bring your payment to my office within the hour as stated. Thomas pushed through the crowd toward the platform, his legs somehow still working despite feeling like water. The three sisters watched him approach, still unable to determine if they had been saved or simply purchased by a different kind of monster. Their experience had taught them that white men's motivations were never to be trusted, that apparent kindness was often prelude to worse cruelty. As Thomas reached them, he did something that shocked everyone present. He spoke directly to them, not to Simmons or the guards, but to the women themselves. "My name is Thomas Whitmore," he said quietly. "I am taking you to my plantation, Riverside. I give you my word that you will not be harmed there. You have my solemn promise." Clara, the eldest, studied his face with eyes that had learned to read men's intentions as a matter of survival. She said nothing, but gave the slightest nod of acknowledgement. Thomas turned to Simmons. "I will return within the hour with payment. Until then, these women are to remain here unmolested. If anyone touches them, the sale is void." Simmons, still calculating his substantial commission, readily agreed. Thomas hurried away to retrieve the money he had left with his banker, his mind already racing ahead to the confrontation he knew was coming and the impossible logistics of what he had just done. He returned 45 minutes later with a heavy pouch of gold coins that represented nearly every dollar of liquidity he possessed. The payment was counted and verified, papers were signed, and ownership was legally transferred. Thomas received a bill of sale, a document he found morally repugnant, even as he folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. The chains were removed from the women's wrists, though Thomas noticed the marks the iron had left on their skin. He gestured toward his wagon, which waited at the edge of the square. "Please," he said, and the word itself was unusual enough to draw surprised looks. Enslaved people were commanded, not asked. The three sisters climbed into the back of the wagon, sitting close together, their body language defensive and wary. Thomas took the reins of his two horses and guided them out of Natchez, very aware of the eyes following their departure. He could feel Blackwood's gaze like a physical weight between his shoulder blades, and he knew that he had made an enemy who would not easily forget this humiliation. The journey to Riverside took nearly 3 hours along rough roads that wound through cotton fields and scattered pine forests. Thomas did not attempt conversation during the ride. He sensed that any words from him right now would be met with deserved suspicion. Instead, he let the silence stretch, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the calls of birds in the trees. As they finally turned onto the long drive leading to his house, Thomas saw his property through what he imagined were their eyes. Riverside was not a grand plantation by the standards of the region. The house was a 2-story structure of white painted wood, with a wraparound porch, comfortable but not ostentatious. Behind it were the outbuildings, the kitchen house, the smokehouse, the barns, and further back, the cabins where enslaved workers lived. Thomas had improved these cabins, adding proper floors and chimneys, but they were still cabins, still housing for people who had no choice about being there. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house. A woman emerged onto the porch, an older black woman named Esther, who served as the household manager. She had been enslaved at Riverside for 40 years, had raised Thomas from childhood after his mother's early death, and was the closest thing to family he had left. Her face showed surprise at the sight of 3 unknown young women in the wagon, but she was too experienced to reveal more than that. "Esther," Thomas said as he climbed down, "these are Clara, Hannah, and Ruth. They will be staying with us. Please prepare the guest rooms in the main house." The emphasis on those last 3 words was deliberate and caused Esther's eyebrows to rise slightly, but she simply nodded. "Yes, Mr. Thomas, I will see to it immediately." The 3 sisters exchanged confused glances. Guest rooms in the main house was not standard treatment for newly purchased enslaved workers. They would have expected to be sent to the cabins, to be immediately put to work, to begin the grinding routine of plantation life. Instead, they were being treated like actual guests, and the incongruity of it only increased their wariness. Thomas helped them down from the wagon, a gesture that further unsettled them since white men did not typically offer physical assistance to enslaved women, except as prelude to assault. Once they were standing on the ground, Thomas addressed them directly. "I know you have no reason to trust me," he began, "and I am not going to pretend that you should. You have been bought and sold like property, and no words of mine can erase that violence. But I want you to understand something. I did not purchase you to exploit you. I purchased you to prevent Cyrus Blackwood from doing so." Hannah, the middle sister, found her voice for the first time, though it came out barely above a whisper. "Why?" The question contained multitudes. Why would a white man spend a fortune to prevent harm to enslaved women he had never met? What was his real motive? What would he demand in return? Thomas sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Because 3 years ago I watched my father die. And in his final hours he begged me to forgive him for the life he had lived, for the people he had owned, for the evil he had participated in. He said he had been a coward, that he had known slavery was wrong, but had lacked the courage to do anything about it. I made him a promise that day that I would find a way to do better, even though I inherited the same impossible situation he left behind." He gestured toward the house. "You will stay in proper rooms. You will eat proper food. You will not be physically punished or violated. I cannot legally free you immediately. The laws of Mississippi make that nearly impossible. But I can treat you as human beings, rather than property, while we work toward your eventual freedom. I have been consulting with lawyers and abolitionist contacts in the North to find a legal path. It will take time, possibly years, but that is my intention." Ruth, the youngest, who had been silent throughout, suddenly spoke up, her voice stronger than her tears suggested. "You expect us to believe that you spent $1,700 out of pure goodness?" Thomas met her eyes steadily. "No," he said. "I do not expect you to believe anything. I expect you to judge me by my actions over time, not by my words today. And if I fail to live up to what I have promised, then you will know me for what I am." Esther returned to announce that rooms were ready. The 3 sisters followed her into the house, still moving with the defensive closeness of people expecting attack at any moment. The interior of the main house was modest but comfortable. The entrance hall had polished wood floors, a staircase leading to the 2nd floor, and walls painted a soft cream color. Esther led them upstairs and showed them to 3 adjoining bedrooms, each furnished with a real bed covered in clean linens, a washstand with basin and pitcher, a small wardrobe, and a window with curtains. For women who had spent their lives sleeping on rough pallets in drafty cabins. This was luxury beyond comprehension, and that very luxury made it more frightening because they could not understand what would be demanded in return for it. "This is where you will sleep," Esther said, her voice neutral but not unkind. "There is water in the pitchers for washing, and I will bring you clean clothes shortly. Supper will be ready in 2 hours. You may come down when you are ready, or I can bring food up to you if you prefer." She left them alone, closing the door softly behind her. The 3 sisters stood in the middle of Clara's room, the largest of the 3, and for a long moment nobody spoke. Then Ruth, the youngest, collapsed onto the bed and began to sob, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. All the terror and confusion and exhaustion of the day came pouring out. Hannah sat beside her and pulled her close, tears streaming down her own face. Clara remained standing, her jaw tight, her fists clenched, fighting to maintain the control that had kept her alive this long. "We do not know what he wants," Clara said, her voice low and hard. "But whatever it is, we face it together. We are still sisters, still bound to each other, even if we are bound to him legally." Hannah nodded, wiping her eyes. "Did you see how the people in town looked at him? They hate him. Whatever he is doing, it is not normal even for this place." "That might be good or it might be worse," Clara replied. "We watch, we wait, we learn. And if he tries to hurt us?" Ruth looked up, her face blotchy from crying. "What can we do? We are his property. The law says he can do anything he wants." Clara knelt down and took both her sisters' hands. "The law may say that, but we are still people. We still have choices, even if all our choices are terrible ones. We can choose to survive, to protect each other, to keep our humanity no matter what they try to take from us. Are you with me?" Both sisters nodded, squeezing Clara's hands. They sat together in silence for a while, drawing strength from each other's presence. Eventually, they heard a soft knock at the door. Esther entered carrying an armload of clothing, simple cotton dresses in dark colors, clean and well-made. "I brought you these," she said, laying them on the bed. "They belonged to Mr. Thomas's mother. She was about your size. There are also underthings and shoes. Take what you need." Clara studied the older woman's face, trying to read what lay beneath the careful neutrality. "You have been here a long time," she said. It was not quite a question. Esther met her gaze steadily. 42 years. "I was brought here when I was 8 years old. I raised Mr. Thomas after his mother died, giving birth to him. I have seen 3 generations of this family, and I have learned when to speak and when to keep silent." "Is he what he seems?" Hannah asked urgently. "Is he truly different, or is this some kind of game?" Esther was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to say. Then she sighed. "Mr. Thomas is not like his father or his grandfather. He went north to school, came back with ideas that do not fit in this place. He has been trying to change things here, trying to treat people better. But he is still a man who owns people, including me. And that is a truth that no amount of kindness can erase." She moved toward the door, then paused. "But I will tell you this. In 42 years, I have learned to recognize the difference between a man who is cruel and a man who is conflicted. Mr. Thomas is conflicted. What that will mean for you, I cannot say. You will have to judge for yourselves." After Esther left, the sisters washed their faces and changed into the clean dresses. The simple act of wearing clothing that was not rags, that fit properly and was clean, felt strange and unsettling. They were being given things that suggested value, personhood, and they did not understand why. When they finally went downstairs for supper, they found the dining room set with real dishes and silverware. Thomas was already seated at the head of the table, and he stood when they entered, a gesture of respect that shocked them. "Please sit," he said, indicating chairs that had been arranged around the table. The meal that followed was one of the strangest experiences of their lives. They sat at a table with a white man who owned them, eating food that was the same food he was eating, roasted chicken and vegetables and fresh bread with butter. Thomas attempted some conversation, asking them about their lives before the auction, but their answers were brief and careful. They were still trying to understand the rules of this new reality, and they were not about to volunteer information that might be used against them. After supper, Thomas excused himself to his study, and the sisters returned to their rooms. That night, none of them slept well. Every creak of the house, every footstep in the hall, sent jolts of fear through them. But no one came. No one tried their doors. No one demanded anything. The night passed in tense waiting, and when morning came and they were still unmolested, still safe in their locked rooms, they began to wonder if perhaps Thomas had been telling the truth, or at least a version of it. The following days established a pattern that was utterly foreign to their experience of slavery. They were not assigned field work or even the brutal domestic labor they had known at the Ashford estate. Instead, Esther gave them light tasks: mending clothes, helping in the kitchen garden, organizing the linen closet, work that kept them occupied but was not physically taxing. Thomas kept his distance, clearly trying not to overwhelm them with his presence. He ate breakfast alone, spent his days out on the plantation managing the work, and appeared only at supper, where he continued his attempts at conversation. Gradually, very gradually, the sisters began to relax their guard slightly. Hannah was the first to show curiosity about their strange situation. One evening at supper, she asked Thomas directly about his plans. "You said you are working toward our freedom," she said. "How? What does that mean?" Thomas set down his fork and considered his answer. "The laws of Mississippi are designed to make manumission as difficult as possible," he explained. "If I free you, you would be required by law to leave the state within 30 days. If you do not, you can be arrested and sold back into slavery. Many freed people end up worse off than before because they have no resources, no support, and no legal protection in most northern states." "So you are saying we can never be free?" Clara said, her voice sharp with anger. Thomas shook his head. "No, I am saying that freedom requires more than a piece of paper. It requires a place to go, money to survive on, and people who will help. I have been corresponding with Quaker communities in Indiana and Ohio. They have agreed to accept refugees and help them establish themselves. I am also trying to save enough money to give each person I free a small stake, enough to buy land or start a business. But it takes time, and in the meantime, I am trying to create something better here, even if it falls far short of actual freedom." Ruth, who rarely spoke, surprised everyone by asking, "Why do you care? You could just keep us, work us like your father and grandfather did, make money from our labor. Why spend your own money trying to free people?" Thomas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been guilt or grief or both. "Because I was raised by Esther," he said. "Because the first face I remember loving was the face of an enslaved woman who had no choice but to care for me. Because I grew up thinking that was normal, that some people were simply born to serve others. And it was not until I went north and saw free black communities, saw people living as equals, that I understood how twisted my entire world was." He looked at each of them in turn. "And because when my father died, his last words were not about God or family or his accomplishments. His last words were a confession of shame and a plea for forgiveness that I cannot give him because he is dead. So I am trying to do what he should have done, what I should have done sooner. I'm trying to be less of a coward than he was, than I have been." The raw honesty of this admission hung in the air. Clara studied Thomas's face and saw genuine anguish there, but she also saw the limits of his understanding. "You still do not fully grasp what you are saying," she said quietly. "You talk about being a coward, about your father's guilt, about your moral struggle. But we did not ask to be the instrument of your redemption. We did not ask to be bought so you could feel better about yourself. We simply wanted to be left alone, to live our lives without being owned or sold or used." Thomas flinched as if she had struck him. "You are right," he said. You are absolutely right, and I have no defense except to say that in a system this evil, there are no clean choices. I could not leave you to Blackwood. I will not apologize for preventing that. But you are right that this is as much about my conscience as it is about your welfare. And that is itself a kind of selfishness. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted. The sisters had seen that Thomas could be challenged, could be made to confront his own assumptions, and he would not respond with violence or anger. This was new territory. Over the following weeks, they began to test other boundaries. Hannah asked to see the plantation account books, claiming she had always been good with numbers. To her surprise, Thomas agreed and began teaching her basic bookkeeping. Ruth, who had been caught reading at the Ashford estate and beaten for it, shyly asked if she might look at the books in Thomas's study. Reading was illegal for enslaved people in Mississippi, a crime punishable by whipping or worse. But Thomas simply showed her where the books were and told her she was welcome to any of them. Clara, the most wary of the three, asked to visit the cabins where the other enslaved workers lived. She wanted to see for herself how they were treated, whether Thomas's claims of running a different kind of plantation were true or merely propaganda. Thomas agreed immediately and assigned Esther to accompany her. What Clara found was complicated. The cabins were better than most, with wooden floors and proper chimneys instead of dirt floors and smoky fire pits. The people were not obviously starving or bearing fresh marks of the whip. But they were still enslaved, still working long hours in the cotton fields, still subject to Thomas's ultimate authority over every aspect of their lives. The small wages they earned were barely enough to buy shoes or a bit of extra food. The families that had been kept together lived in constant fear that economic necessity might force Thomas to sell someone anyway. Clara reported back to her sisters that night. "He is better than most," she said. "But better than most still means complicit in evil. The people here are still trapped. We are still trapped, just in a prettier cage. And yet, as spring turned to summer, something unexpected happened." The sisters began to feel not gratitude exactly, but a kind of cautious alliance with Thomas. They were all trapped in the same terrible system, albeit from vastly different positions of power, and they all wanted to find a way out. Hannah discovered that Thomas's finances were in worse shape than he had admitted. The $1,700 he had spent on them had put him deep in debt. The plantation was barely breaking even, and he was quietly selling off assets to fund his manumission plans. He was, in effect, bankrupting himself in slow motion. Ruth found in Thomas's study a journal where he recorded his thoughts and struggles. She knew she should not read it, that it was a violation of privacy, but curiosity overcame scruple. What she found there was a man tearing himself apart with guilt and indecision, writing long philosophical arguments with himself about duty and morality, copying out quotes from abolitionist literature and slaveholder apologetics, as if by seeing both sides on paper he might find some synthesis that would absolve him. One entry in particular struck her. It read, "I tell myself I am working toward their freedom, but how many years will I ask them to wait? How long does patience become merely another word for cowardice? My father waited until his deathbed to confess his sins. I am 32. How many more years will I steal from 70 lives before I find the courage to act?" Ruth shared this with her sisters. Hannah was moved, but Clara remained skeptical. "Words are easy," she said. "Actions matter." But as summer progressed, and Thomas's financial situation grew more desperate, his actions began to speak louder than his words. He sold 2 of his finest horses to raise money. He let go of his overseer Daniels, who had been demanding a raise, and took over the management of the plantation himself, working alongside the enslaved field workers in the cotton rows. This was scandalous behavior for a plantation owner, and it further damaged his already compromised reputation in the county. Neighbors who had merely disapproved of him before now openly mocked him, calling him a fool who was destroying his inheritance for the sake of misguided sentiment. The hostility was not merely social. Cyrus Blackwood had not forgotten or forgiven Thomas's interference at the auction. He spread vicious rumors throughout the county, claiming that Thomas was keeping a harem in his house, that he was planning to incite a slave rebellion, that he was a danger to the entire community. These rumors found fertile ground among men who already resented Thomas's implicit criticism of their own practices. If treating enslaved people well was moral, then what did that make those who treated them badly? It was easier to destroy Thomas than to examine their own consciences. The pressure increased throughout the summer of 1851. Thomas received threatening letters, unsigned warnings that he should leave Mississippi or face consequences. One night, someone shot through the window of his study, the bullet missing him by inches and embedding itself in the wall. Another night, a fire was set in one of his barns, destroying equipment and killing 2 horses before it could be controlled. Thomas hired armed guards to patrol the property, but the attacks continued in more subtle forms. His credit was cut off at local merchants. His cotton buyers suddenly found reasons to offer him prices below market rate. He was excluded from the social networks that made plantation ownership viable. The informal agreements about labor sharing during harvest, the collective action against runaway slaves, the political influence that protected property rights. He was being systematically isolated and economically strangled. Clara, Hannah, and Ruth watched all of this with growing alarm. They had not asked Thomas to sacrifice himself for them, and they were acutely aware that if his plantation failed, they would likely be sold to pay his debts, and there was no guarantee the next owner would be anyone but Blackwood. One evening, Clara found Thomas in his study staring at a ledger that showed his debts mounting and his assets dwindling. "You cannot keep doing this," she said bluntly. "You are destroying yourself." Thomas looked up at her with exhausted eyes. "What would you have me do? Sell you back into slavery to balance my books? Send you to Blackwood to pay off my debts?" Clara pulled up a chair and sat down across from him, a gesture of equality that would have been unthinkable months ago. "I would have you be smart instead of merely noble," she said. "You are trying to save everyone, and you are going to end up saving no one. Make a plan that is actually possible instead of this slow financial suicide." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "I am listening." Clara took a deep breath. "You have been trying to save money to free all 70 enslaved people here and get them safely north. That is going to take years you do not have. Your enemies will destroy you long before then. But what if you started smaller? What if you freed a few people at a time, starting with those who have the best chance of making it north safely? Young people without children, people with skills that would help them survive. You could establish a network, a pathway. Each group that successfully escapes could help the next group. It would be faster, safer, and harder for your enemies to stop all at once." Thomas considered this. It made strategic sense, but it also meant making impossible choices about who got freed first and who had to wait. "How do I choose?" he asked. "How do I decide that one person's freedom is more urgent than another's?" "You do not," Hannah said from the doorway. They had not heard her approach, but she had clearly been listening. "You let people choose for themselves. Tell everyone your plan, explain the risks and the possibilities, and let those who are willing to take the chance go first. Some will want to wait until it is safer, some will not want to leave family behind, some will be ready to risk everything for freedom now. Let them decide their own fate as much as possible." Ruth appeared behind Hannah. "And start with us," she said quietly. "We have no children, no family except each other. We are young and healthy. We can make the journey. And if we succeed, we can help build the network for others who follow." Thomas looked at the 3 of them, these women he had bought to save, who were now proposing a plan to save themselves, and potentially many others. It was risky, probably illegal, definitely dangerous. If caught, Thomas could be arrested for aiding fugitive slaves, a serious crime that could result in years in prison. The sisters themselves could be captured and returned, or worse, but it was also a real plan, practical and possible in ways his vague notion of saving everyone someday was not. "All right," he said. "We will do it, but we do it carefully, with preparation and help. I have contacts with the Underground Railroad through my Quaker connections. We will need to coordinate timing, establish safe houses, arrange for guides. This will take a few weeks to set up properly. In the meantime, we tell no one. The fewer people who know, the safer everyone will be." Over the following weeks, Thomas wrote encrypted letters to his contacts in the North. He received responses hidden in shipments of goods, messages written in lemon juice that appeared only when heated, instructions for reaching safe houses on the route north. He converted more of his assets to portable wealth, gold coins that could be sewn into clothing or hidden in false-bottomed bags. He purchased clothing suitable for travel and supplies for a long journey, and he met secretly with a few trusted people on his plantation, explaining his plan and asking if they wanted to be among the first to go. The response was mixed, as Hannah had predicted. Some people were eager, willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Others were terrified, pointing out that the journey north was dangerous and that free black people in the North still faced terrible discrimination and limited opportunities. Some older people said they had been enslaved too long to imagine any other life and preferred the modest security of Riverside to the uncertainty of flight. And some families with children felt they could not risk the journey with little ones who might cry at the wrong moment or slow the group down. Ultimately, Thomas identified a group of 12 people who were willing to make the first attempt. Clara, Hannah, and Ruth. A young man named Samuel, who had been separated from his wife when her owner sold her to a plantation in Louisiana and wanted to try reaching her. 2 brothers in their 20s named Isaac and Benjamin, who had no living family. An older woman named Patience, who was skilled as a midwife and healer. A teenage girl named Abigail, whose mother had died the previous winter, and who had no reason to remain. And 3 others, each with their own stories of loss and hope that made freedom worth the risk. Thomas met with the group one evening in the barn, far from the main house where their gathering might be observed. He spread a map on a table and showed them the route they would take. "You will travel at night and hide during the day," he explained. "The first leg will take you north through Mississippi to Tennessee. That is the most dangerous part, because you will still be in slave territory and the patrollers are active. But I have contacts who will hide you and provide food and guidance. Once you reach Tennessee, you will connect with Underground Railroad conductors who will take you through Kentucky and into Indiana. The whole journey will take between 3 and 6 weeks depending on conditions." Samuel studied the map with a practical eye. "What if we are caught?" Thomas met his gaze steadily. "If you are caught, you will be returned and likely sold. I will not be able to protect you. You need to understand that this is dangerous, and I cannot guarantee success. Everyone in this barn needs to decide if freedom is worth the risk." There was a long silence. Then Patience, the midwife, spoke in a voice weathered by years. "I am 53 years old. I was born enslaved, I have lived enslaved, and if I die tomorrow, I will die enslaved. But if I can have even one day of freedom before I die, that will be worth any risk." The others nodded in agreement, and Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. The departure was planned for a moonless night in late September. The 12 would slip away in small groups over the course of 3 hours, making their way to a rendezvous point in the woods, 3 miles from the plantation where a guide would meet them. Thomas spent the days before their departure in a state of controlled panic, second-guessing every detail of the plan, worrying about every possible thing that could go wrong. Clara found him in the study the night before, staring at the map as if he could will them safely north through sheer concentration. "Tomorrow we become fugitives," she said. How do you feel? Terrified, Thomas admitted. If this goes wrong, I will have made your lives worse instead of better. If you are caught, if you are hurt, it will be my fault. Clara sat down across from him. No, she said firmly. If we are caught, it will be the fault of the men who made the laws that say human beings can be owned. It will be the fault of the system that treats us as property. You did not create this evil, and you are trying to fight it in the only way you can. That is more than most people do. Whatever happens tomorrow, we make our choice freely. That means something. The next night arrived with agonizing slowness. Thomas could barely eat, could barely sit still. When darkness finally fell and the first group prepared to leave, he met them at the edge of the property. He handed each person a small bag of supplies, food and water for 3 days, a blanket, and a pouch of coins. He had written letters of introduction to his contacts that he gave to Clara, the de facto leader of the group. And then there was nothing left to say except the inadequate words that felt both too much and too little. Be safe, he told them. Be careful. I will be watching for word that you arrived. Clara looked at him in the darkness. This conflicted man who had been their owner and was now something like their accomplice. Thank you, she said simply. And then they were gone, melting into the darkness of the Mississippi night. 12 souls seeking freedom, leaving behind the only world they had ever known. Thomas returned to his house and tried to sleep, but could not. He lay awake imagining every possible disaster. The next days were torture. He went through the motions of running the plantation, but his mind was hundreds of miles away, following the path he had traced on the map. He watched the roads for signs of patrollers returning with captured fugitives. He listened for news from town about runaways being caught. And he waited for the coded messages that would tell him if his plan had succeeded or failed. The first message arrived 2 weeks later, hidden in a shipment of supplies from a merchant in Tennessee. It was brief, written in the agreed-upon code. Package received. All goods in acceptable condition. Moving to next station. Thomas felt tears of relief prick his eyes. They had made it through Mississippi and Tennessee. They were alive and still free. The next message came 3 weeks after that. Package delivered to final destination. All goods accounted for. Buyer satisfied. They had made it. All 12 of them had successfully reached Indiana and the Quaker community that had agreed to accept them. Thomas sat alone in his study and wept, overwhelmed by relief and grief and the knowledge that this was just the beginning. Word of the successful escape gradually spread through the remaining enslaved community at Riverside, though Thomas had asked everyone to maintain secrecy. The mood changed. People who had been resigned to lifelong enslavement began to whisper about possibilities. More people came to Thomas expressing interest in attempting the journey. He knew he needed to wait before organizing another group to let the initial alarm die down, but he also knew that he had started something he could not stop, and he did not want to stop. For the first time since his father's death, Thomas felt like he was actually making a difference instead of merely contemplating it. But Blackwood had not been idle. The disappearance of 12 enslaved workers from Riverside had been noticed, and while Thomas claimed they had simply run off on their own, Blackwood suspected assistance. He began investigating, bribing local officials, questioning merchants, following trails of correspondence. And slowly, methodically, he began to build a case. The confrontation came on a cold November evening. Thomas was in his study when Esther rushed in to announce that the county sheriff had arrived with several men. Thomas went to the door and found Sheriff Morrison standing on his porch with a document in his hand and Cyrus Blackwood smirking behind him. "Thomas Whitmore," Morrison said formally, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of aiding fugitive slaves in violation of the laws of Mississippi. You will come with us now." Thomas felt his world tilting but forced himself to remain calm. On what evidence? Blackwood stepped forward, his satisfaction evident. On the evidence of correspondence with known abolitionists, of financial transactions that match the pattern of Underground Railroad funding, and on the testimony of a merchant in Tennessee who identified you from a description when questioned about recent suspicious activities. You thought you were clever, Thomas, but you were not clever enough. Thomas knew his choices were limited. He could resist arrest, but that would only make things worse. He could flee, but where would he go and what would happen to the remaining people on his plantation? Or he could face the consequences of his actions and hope that something could be salvaged. He chose to face them. "I will come peacefully," he said. "But I want my lawyer notified immediately." He was taken to the county jail in Natchez, a squat building with barred windows and the smell of human misery. The cell they put him in was small and dark, with only a thin pallet on a wooden bench for sleeping. But Thomas barely noticed his surroundings. His mind was racing through possibilities and consequences. If convicted of aiding fugitive slaves, he could face up to 5 years in prison and massive fines. His plantation would be seized to pay his debts. The remaining enslaved people at Riverside would be sold at auction, and there was nothing to prevent Blackwood from buying them. Everything he had tried to accomplish would be undone. His lawyer, a cautious man named Anderson who had handled his father's affairs, came to see him the next day. "The charges are serious," Anderson said bluntly. "The evidence is circumstantial but suggestive. If they can prove you actively assisted in the escape, you will almost certainly be convicted. Your best hope is to argue that the slaves ran away on their own, and that any correspondence with Northern abolitionists was merely philosophical discussion, not practical coordination." Thomas shook his head. "I will not lie about what I did. If I am going to be convicted, let it be for actually helping people gain freedom, not for some cowardly evasion." Anderson sighed. "Then you will likely go to prison, and your noble gesture will have accomplished nothing except your own ruin." "Perhaps," Thomas said. "Or perhaps 12 people are free who would otherwise be enslaved, and that alone makes it worthwhile." The trial took place in January 1852, in a courtroom packed with spectators eager to see the conclusion of this scandal that had gripped the county for months. The prosecutor, a bombastic man named Carlyle who was friends with Blackwood, painted Thomas as a dangerous radical who was undermining the entire social order of the South. He presented evidence of Thomas's correspondence with abolitionists, of his known sympathies for enslaved people, of his reckless purchase of the 3 sisters at the auction. He called witnesses who testified to seeing strangers on the roads near Riverside around the time of the disappearances, and he argued that the circumstantial evidence taken together proved beyond doubt that Thomas had knowingly aided fugitive slaves. Anderson mounted a defense based on reasonable doubt. He pointed out that enslaved people ran away all the time without assistance, that correspondence with Northern intellectuals did not prove criminal activity, that Thomas's treatment of his enslaved workers might have actually reduced the likelihood of flight since people treated well had less reason to run. But his arguments rang hollow even to Anderson himself, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. Then something unexpected happened. On the 3rd day of the trial, as the prosecution rested its case, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. Esther had arrived, and she was not alone. With her were 24 people from Riverside Plantation, enslaved workers who had risked severe punishment to come to town without permission. They filed into the courtroom and stood along the back wall, silent but present, their mere appearance a statement. The judge, a stern man named Whitfield, banged his gavel. "What is the meaning of this?" Esther stepped forward. "Your Honor," she said with a dignity that commanded respect, "we have come to testify on behalf of Mr. Thomas Whitmore." The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "These are slaves. They cannot testify in court against white men." Esther met the judge's eyes steadily. "We are not testifying against anyone. We are testifying for Mr. Thomas, and the law allows enslaved people to testify in support of their masters." She was right, and Judge Whitfield knew it. He nodded slowly. "Very well. You may testify, but be brief." Esther walked to the witness stand with the bearing of a queen. She was sworn in, and then she spoke. "I have known Thomas Whitmore since the day he was born. I raised him after his mother died. I have watched him struggle with the inheritance his father left him, trying to figure out how to be a good man in an evil system." She looked directly at the jury. "Did he help those 12 people escape?" "I do not know for certain, but I know this. Every person on Riverside Plantation is treated with more dignity than they would be anywhere else in this county. No one is whipped, no one is starved, no families are separated. If 12 people chose to run, maybe they ran because Mr. Thomas gave them just enough hope to believe freedom was possible. And if he helped them, then he did what any decent person should do when faced with injustice. He chose humanity over law." The courtroom erupted in chaos. The prosecutor demanded that Esther's testimony be stricken from the record, that she be removed and punished for her insolence. But Judge Whitfield, who was known to be a fair man within the constraints of his deeply unjust position, allowed the testimony to stand. One by one, other people from Riverside came forward and testified. They spoke of Thomas's kindness, his efforts to improve their living conditions, his refusal to use violence. They created a portrait of a man who, whatever his legal guilt, was morally trying to do right. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, their verdict was surprising. Guilty on the technical charges of aiding fugitive slaves, but with a recommendation for leniency given the defendant's otherwise good character and the mitigating testimony. Judge Whitfield sentenced Thomas to 1 year in county jail and a fine of $1,000. It was far less than it could have been, but it was still devastating. Thomas's property would be liquidated to pay the fine and his debts. The enslaved people at Riverside would be sold. His life as he had known it was over. But before the sentence could be carried out, something remarkable happened. The enslaved community at Riverside, in coordination with Esther, organized a collection. They pooled the small wages Thomas had been paying them over the past 2 years, money they had been saving against an uncertain future. They approached several free black tradesmen in Natchez who had done business with Thomas and found him fair, and they went to the Quaker community in Indiana that had received the 12 fugitives and explained the situation. Together, these unlikely allies raised enough money to pay Thomas's fine and purchase at auction several of the people who would otherwise have been sold to strangers. It was not enough to save everyone, but it saved some, and it represented something powerful. A multiracial coalition of people who had decided that Thomas's attempted justice deserved support, even when it had failed. Thomas served his year in jail, during which time Blackwood managed to purchase Riverside Plantation at auction for a fraction of its value. When Thomas was released in January 1853, he emerged to find that he owned nothing, had no home, and was a convicted criminal in a society that already hated him. But waiting for him outside the jail were Esther, several people from Riverside who had been purchased by Northern sympathizers and freed, and a letter from Clara in Indiana. The letter read, "We have established a community here where former slaves are building new lives. We have land, we have work, and we have freedom. There is a place for you here, if you want it. You are not our savior, Thomas. You are just a man who tried to do better than the world you were born into. But that is something, and there is work still to be done. Come north. Help us build something different." Thomas made his way north over the following months, working odd jobs to pay for his passage, arriving in Indiana in the summer of 1853. What he found there was a thriving community of formerly enslaved people who had taken the freedom he helped them gain and built something real with it. Clara, Hannah, and Ruth had purchased adjoining farms with the money he had given them. Samuel had been reunited with his wife through the network of Underground Railroad contacts. Patience was serving as a midwife for the community, and they had helped others who came after them, creating a network of support that made each subsequent escape easier. Thomas settled in the community and began teaching, using his education to help formerly enslaved people learn to read and write and navigate the complicated world of free society. He also became involved in the Underground Railroad, using his experience and connections to help coordinate escapes from the South. Over the next 12 years, before the Civil War finally ended slavery, Thomas played a role in helping over 300 people reach freedom. He never became wealthy again. He never held political office or achieved fame. He lived in a small house on the edge of the community, teaching during the day and working for the Underground Railroad at night, wearing himself out in the service of a cause that consumed him. But he had something he had not had when he was a wealthy plantation owner. He had peace. He had kept the promise he made to his dying father. He had done more than just contemplate doing better. He had actually done it at enormous personal cost, but with results that mattered. Clara, Hannah, and Ruth remained close to Thomas throughout his life. They never let him forget that his attempt at redemption was not about him, that their freedom was their own achievement as much as his gift. But they also acknowledged that in a world where most white people chose comfort over justice, Thomas had chosen differently. When he died in 1889 at age 70, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. Clara, now an elderly woman herself, delivered a eulogy that captured the complexity of their relationship. Thomas Whitmore was born into a system of evil, she said, and he was complicit in that evil for longer than he should have been. He did not save us from slavery. We saved ourselves with his help, and that is an important distinction. But he did something that many white people in his position refused to do. He looked at the injustice around him and decided it was wrong. And then he spent the rest of his life trying to make it right, even when it cost him everything. That does not make him a hero. It makes him a human being who chose to act like one. And in a world that so often rewards cruelty and punishes compassion, that choice matters. The 3 sisters he bought to save from Blackwood all outlived him. Hannah became a teacher who educated hundreds of formerly enslaved children. Ruth became a writer who documented the stories of escaped slaves and Underground Railroad workers. And Clara became a leader in the community, helping newly arrived refugees establish themselves and fight for their rights. They never forgot the terror of standing on that auction block in Natchez, never forgot the uncertainty of those first weeks at Riverside, never forgot the dangerous journey north. But they also never forgot that in the midst of systemic evil, there had been people who chose to resist, who paid prices for that resistance, and who demonstrated that even in the darkest times, individual choices could matter. This is not a simple story of a white savior rescuing helpless victims. It is a complicated story of people trapped in an evil system who found ways to subvert it, who took risks for each other, who built coalitions across racial lines despite the laws and social norms that tried to prevent such solidarity. Thomas was neither hero nor villain, but something more human, a flawed person who made serious mistakes, who acted too slowly for too long, but who ultimately chose conscience over comfort when the choice became unavoidable. And Clara, Hannah, and Ruth were not passive recipients of his charity, but active agents in their own liberation. People who seized the opportunities available to them and built lives of dignity and purpose out of the fragments of freedom they could grasp. The story of what Thomas Whitmore did when he bought 3 enslaved women shocked his community because it violated every expectation of his society. He was supposed to exploit them, abuse them, or at minimum treat them as property to be used for his economic benefit. Instead, he treated them as people, worked toward their freedom, and ultimately sacrificed his wealth and status to help them and hundreds of others escape bondage. That choice, replicated by enough people, challenged the entire logic of slavery. It demonstrated that the system depended on white people choosing cruelty or indifference, and that when enough people chose differently, the system became unsustainable. Thomas's story did not end the way he might have imagined when he stood at that auction in 1851. He did not successfully free everyone on his plantation while maintaining his wealth and position. He did not single-handedly dismantle slavery. He ended up in jail, bankrupt, and exiled from his home. But he helped 300 people reach freedom. He helped build a community where formerly enslaved people could live with dignity. And he demonstrated that individual moral courage, even when imperfect and costly, could make a real difference in real lives. That was what he did with the 3 enslaved women he bought, and it was what shocked everyone who knew him. Not because he treated them kindly, but because he allowed that kindness to fundamentally change the trajectory of his entire life, accepting losses most people in his position would never have contemplated. And in doing so, he became part of a larger story of resistance and liberation that included thousands of enslaved people who freed themselves, abolitionists who risked everything to help them, and communities that proved that a different way of living was possible even before the law caught up with morality. That is the story of Thomas Whitmore and the 3 sisters whose lives intersected with his on a hot July day in Natchez, Mississippi in 1851. It is a story of how evil systems are sustained by individual choices and how they can be challenged the same way. It is not a comfortable story or a simple one, but it is true in the ways that matter most.